Hello and welcome to another alternate media special, another edition of, you could even say, Killing the Church. The Sects Talk. That's the series that we've been on, and tonight is the bonus episode, kind of a final episode to wrap up the subject and put a nice little bow on it at the end. So what sect of Judaism would Yeshua himself have been part of? This is a very controversial topic. Before we continue, let me go ahead and bring on my co-host here, my colleague, my brother from another mother.
What's up?
How are you tonight, sir?
I am fantastic. I'm actually looking forward to what we're drinking tonight.
What are we drinking tonight?
So I found this little lovely thing. It's a Texas rye. Yeah, 100 proof.
That looks so good.
I am so excited. They were doing like a taste testing on base actually. And so I decided to try some of this and I was like, ooh. And so now this is me cracking open for the first time my own bottle of this Texas rye. Now, I'm not usually a rye person, but my wife is. And so,
really,
yeah, so she actually got me in on this because she was like, "Oh, we gotta get this stuff," and I was like, "Okay," So
she's so much cooler now.
So it's thanks to her. So, what are you drinking tonight?
I am actually bringing out an oldie but goodie, the
nice.
Dragon's Milk, because I still just have the Maker's Mark that I've been on.
I don't like Dragon's Milk,
but my beer tonight will be a Dragon's Milk. It's gonna be a good time.
I don't like Dragon's Milk.
You don't like Dragon's Milk?
I couldn't get into it. It just wasn't. I don't know.
Well, it's bourbon barrel aged, and it is an imperial stout. So I mean, I like it.
Well, so everyone's read the title correctly, and also the description, I'm sure, where it says, "Yeah, you read that right." Jesus the Pharisee. So, if you got some hate, leave it in the comment section. Might as well. And I'm actually looking forward to a storm of a comment section. So please let it rip, let it happen, get her up there. And we'll address some questions while we go. We'll address some common objections. We'll address some further clues. We'll talk about scholarship and hey, like I said, if the chat is wild enough, we'll bring you on and we'll address some of those questions, because boy, do we have a lot to cover for this. Mostly because we have to punch through a massive brick wall of just stubborn Christian history of hatred for Phariseeism, a blind hatred for Phariseeism, I might add.
Blind is I would say a good word, because there's generally no rhyme or reason for it. It's not a scripturally based, or at least as much as it's attempted to be a scripturally based conviction. It's based on numerous presuppositions that are just not found in the text.
And oh wow, that's really good. Ooh.
Jelly.
Wow, I really like rye now. Boy, that's like, it's sweet and all right. I'm getting distracted. It is very good though, this Texas rye. Yeah, so it's sort of like how forgive the analogy here, but I can't really come up with a better one in recent history, at least on the spot right now. But love him or hate him, whatever you feel of him, the way leftists tend to react to Donald Trump is very much the same way in which Christians react to the idea of Jesus being a Pharisee.
Yes.
It's just like, it doesn't matter. He said it. I hate it. Like not tracking with it, totally against it. And it's because of this really, really negative view of Phariseeism in general that it is simply impossible for him to have been a Pharisee because of that. Yeah. So that's the wall we're punching through. That's the hard part. It doesn't take much to prove that he was a Pharisee. Honestly, it just takes an enormous amount of time to go over every single little objection that people bring up that really aren't good objections, but we got to address them anyway because
right.
we talk about them.
you have to be willing to, first of all, view the New Testament for what it is, admit what it is, and what it is not a document intended to record history. It's a document intended to tell a particular story, right? It's recounting certain events, but it's not trying to give you a full-scale picture of all of the history going around. If you can admit that and you can acknowledge that and accept that, then what you're admitting is that the New Testament is not a self-sufficient document to educate you on the Pharisees at the time.
Right. For those of the Christians whose only many Christians only what's the exposure to any Judaism at all comes from the New Testament. And that's not a good source to give you an idea. Like you sort of have to know Judaism before you even come to the New Testament to begin with. But for many Christians, it's the other way around. And because of that backwards approach, it starts out with a very vitriolic, sort of, I hate the Pharisees because they're all legalists. And then they study Judaism with that in mind, rather than studying Judaism first and then reading the New Testament from that particular context, which that's the context in which Yeshua is coming from.
That is another thing is part of the vitriol comes from a position of general ignorance. People will make these broad sweeping statements about why Yeshua was rebuking the Pharisees because of something that they were or weren't teaching or doing. And generally, these people have no idea what the Pharisees believed. They have no idea what Pharisaic doctrine is, right? They haven't actually looked enough to study and be informed on the subject. They are simply trusting what they are interpreting, and I would dare say even projecting into what the New Testament says about the Pharisees.
Yeah, so that's why it took us 5 parts to get to this episode. In the first 4 episodes, we basically go over all of the information necessary for you to go into this episode with a solid idea of what to expect, and some presuppositions that need to sort of be had. So instead of wasting time on this episode to go back over all that information, if you're watching this live, stick around. But if you're watching this in the future and this is a recording, pause it and go back and at least watch parts 3 and 4 with the Pharisees and then Shammai and Hillel particularly, in order for you to really understand what we're going into here for part 5. A lot of that information is going to be important for what we talk about here tonight. So without further ado, let's just jump on into it. 9 minutes into the show, the comment section is boring right now. For now, we'll see how this goes. But Jesus was most likely, incredibly likely. You can never say anything with 100% certainty, but we're like 95 to 98% sure that Yeshua.
I would lean more towards 98, and I'll discuss why later when we get to that part of the show and the topic.
That's the scholar in me talking. Right. My personal opinion is that he was 100% a Pharisee. That's my personal feeling, and that's my bias, obviously. So as a good historian, I should admit my bias. But based on the scholarship, I'm fully convinced. But generally speaking, all things considered, you can never say anything with absolute certainty. And so somewhere in the ballpark of 95 and 98, scholarship would agree.
Right. And that I think is worth noting, is that even modern Christian scholarship is already leaning in this direction, right? So if you're very vehemently disagreeing with this position, you're actually just disagreeing with the direction that Christian scholarship is already headed in.
Yeah. Yeah. And we go over this in episode 1 and 2, I believe, where we talk about the different options of Judaism that you could really have in the first century. And we've narrowed it down to basically this is the last option for Yeshua to where he fits in the Jewish world of his day. This is it. This is the last option. And so it's, that doesn't always mean 100% that this is, he therefore fits into this category. But what we're about to go over today, we're going to put the nail in the door I don't want to say coffin because Jesus rose again. So, so
The resurrection is what? A Pharisee teaching.
Yeah. So, a couple of things that Jesus was a Pharisee. One, I just said it. Of all the other options available to first century Judaism, he doesn't fit in any of the other categories by a long shot. So this sort of leaves the last option. Other than that, the only other option other than this would just be a normal, like nothing special, not educated farmer.
Right.
And we know that he was either a carpenter or a stonemason by trade, of course, but that does not disqualify. What I mean by commoner is like a know nothing, somebody who literally doesn't take sides in the political, synagogue politics. He shows up, he does his prayers, he doesn't know anything, he's not a theologian, he's not a teacher, he's nothing. But once you step into the realm of theologian, you end up picking a side, sort of, and Pharisee is the one that Jesus fits most likely into.
Right. And I think I pointed this out pretty early on in this series, but it's worth noting again, and maybe going into a bit more detail, is the silence is deafening when we consider Yeshua's interactions with the various different sects of Judaism that existed at this time. He really only has one major encounter with the Sadducees outside of his trial, and he dismisses them entirely. Right? He doesn't even give them the time of day, which is fascinating when you consider that they were biblical literalists and did not believe in an oral tradition. So people of that mindset, he wrote off entirely. Like, you're not worth talking to. Bye. In the modern vernacular, what he says to them would amount to, you're too ignorant to realize that you're stupid.
He was the most sarcastic with Sadducees, for sure.
Right. And he didn't waste time arguing with them. That is the main point I'm getting at. We also don't see him really interact with Essenes ever. Again, there's like one vague reference that doesn't say Essene, but like the title it does use has been speculated to possibly hint at an Essene, and that's like one citation, and it's one verse. It's isolated, and I don't even remember which verse that is. But his conversations with the Pharisees are ubiquitous throughout the gospel narrative. They happen all the time.
Yeah.
Why? Why is he so invested in discussing theology with Pharisees and is not willing to give time to anybody else?
They were his peers. And actually, so we'll do this in sequential order, because we are going to go into the whole he is a peer with them. But Bobby raised a fun, he cannot be a Pharisee, he yelled at them. So this brings up, so we have a number of common objections that we're going to taco about. And the first one, common objection: he hated the Pharisees. He spoke down to them. He ridiculed them all the time. Very, very common objection. In fact, this is usually the first objection we hear. So what's our answer, Brad?
Well, this is actually one of the many evidences that he was a Pharisee. Because Pharisees rebuked each other all the time. It was commonplace. Matter of fact, anybody who has taken the time to read through the Talmud, even just a little bit, finds out very quickly that this is what good Pharisees did, right?
Yeah, the level of supposed hatred that Pharisees trade between fellow Pharisees in the Talmud is equal, if not worse, than what Yeshua says in Matthew 23 or Luke 11, for example. If you just open up a Talmud and read Yevamot page 16 alpha, you'll find that it's some Pharisees call others sons of Satan. It sounds like the same kind of conversations that Yeshua is having, but it's between Pharisees. So this common objection is actually the first clue that he is a fellow Pharisee.
Well, and we've got a comment here in the comment section that illustrates exactly what I'm about to explain, right? But here's a personal example. right? I used to yell at people in the Baptist church when I was a Baptist. Yeah, same. But
yeah, we were
but
all there. You know,
this
it's easier to have those kinds of conversations with the people you know the best. You know what I mean?
right.
And also with the theology you know the best, right? Like I'm not going to get into a screaming competition with a Black Hebrew Israelite, just as an example. I'm going to be talking mostly and arguing with mostly other Christians because I know the ground they stand on. So I'm going to have that conversation with them. And the BHIs, I'm not going to give the time of day. They're sort of the Sadducees to me. But,
Right. It's one of those things where I've even got an article on the website addressing this. This argument does not hold water when you apply it to any other scenario in the modern age that would be an equivalent, right? So my article focuses specifically on a dynamic and a theoretical comparison between Stephen Anderson and James White, right? And specifically because I have watched a conversation that the two of them had with one another, right? Now, those who know Stephen Anderson know that he's a bit of a hothead, right? And he's prone to vitriol and foot and mouth disease. And, meanwhile, James White tends to choose his words much more eloquently and wisely. You don't agree with the guy on most things, but he's at least polite. I mean, are we to suppose that either James White or Stephen Anderson are not Christians because they had a conversation where they disagreed and Stephen Anderson possibly got a little heated in his responses to James White? That means that one of them is not a Christian? Well, that doesn't make any sense. Christians argue all the time.
Yeah, and it doesn't just, if you've seen our previous episode, we talk about Shammai and Hillel, and Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, respectively, had heated debates and conversations that rose to the level of calling each other Satan's sons pretty regularly and all the time. And so, yeah, once again, this rather common objection is actually the first clue that he was a Pharisee, which sort of leads me into my next point. And so I'm sort of speaking from the historian's perspective now. We live in a day and an age where we don't really take classism very seriously. We're not used to it, especially Americans. It's not something that really exists in our culture at all.
American culture was established specifically to usurp classism.
Yeah.
That's the point of America.
That's what made America unique. In its very early stages, people from Europe were coming over and realizing that the common everyday window washer would say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, to everybody equally, no matter their wealth status, or it didn't matter. Everyone was treated largely with the same level of respect as though there were no such thing as royalty, which in American culture there wasn't. So now that's part of what's hard for us to sort of grasp in the modern age. So I'm asking the listener to kind of take a step back and look at this from the very classist society that is the ancient world. And the Pharisees, although they come from a fairly middle class development, as we talked about in one of our previous episodes, once you were a Pharisee, you were in that rank structure now. You were separate from the common people, and so people would address you very respectfully. People that were not as your peer would call you rabbi or some other term of high respect. My teacher, our teacher, Rabbeinu, Chacham, wise one, you name it. And back then, you would never speak to somebody above you with this kind of disrespect. You would only ever do that on a peer-to-peer level. And so the fact that he speaks to them so harshly and heavily is actually a big key indicator that not only does the community see him as a fellow peer because they give him the time of day, they're constantly having conversations with him, but they let him talk to them like this because they see him as equals and not as the regular, like the Am Haaretz, the people of the earth, the lower class. Now, Hillelite Pharisees and Pharisees in general actually got along really, really well with lower class individuals. That's actually what made them very, very popular, was that they were very friendly to the lower class. But still, this rank structure is very much in place. It's like military. And so actually, Bradley, we walk me into this one. Why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands? Some of your disciples eat with unwashed hands. That's an officer talking to an officer about their juniors.
Yep.
Another officer doesn't go to a different unit's juniors and make corrections that they don't belong to him. He would go to that officer who is in command of those juniors and tell him to make the correction. And that's actually what we see happening with Jesus and the Pharisees.
A very good example I can think of, actually, just off the top of my head, to kind of the classist structure that we see. Most of us have probably seen a martial arts movie that's based in feudal Asia at some point in our lives, right? And usually it's about some kind of rivalry between different styles and different schools, things of that nature. One thing that maybe you don't notice because it just seems like it's unimportant, but it's something that is important to notice because it brings to light this level of classism, is that never at any point does one of the students of a rival school just mouth off to the teacher of that rival school, right? And the one who did was considered to be the most dishonorable of his class at that point. And that's because that's exactly how it worked, right? The two instructors of the rival schools, right? They could talk to each other disrespectfully,
right?
But a student of a rival would never dare to disrespect the masters of his rivals.
I'm glad you brought that up, because after Yeshua dies and resurrects and ascends into heaven, the disciples take over. And the vitriol against Phariseeism stops suddenly. Why? Because none of his disciples were bona fide Pharisees. They were of the Pharisee party, so to speak, but they themselves are not recognized as pure Pharisees. And so they never spoke out. They never treated the Pharisees with the same vitriol that Yeshua does, because it was not their place to do so. And they respected that even after Yeshua's death.
That's a fascinating thing that I had never considered until you just said it now. But yeah, no, there's never at any point in any of the general epistles or in the book of Acts that we see any of the apostles speaking to the Pharisees with the same vitriol that we see Yeshua speaking.
Right.
That's because even if they did disagree, it was not their place to say that, right? It was not their place to speak that way to those who outranked them in the class structure, which again lends to the idea that Yeshua was a Pharisee.
Right. And I'm going to take a pause real quick. I'm going to recommend a book here by Rabbi Harvey Falk. He is not a believer in Jesus, but this is just one of many books that actually kind of help explain what we're talking about. So if you're wondering where we're getting some of our sources and our scholastic material from, this is a good book. Jesus, the Jewish Theologian by Young is another great book. But this one's really good because he's actually telling you from the Jewish perspective. And so he himself, being a rabbinic Jew who studies ancient Phariseeism, basically he read through the New Testament and was like, oh, okay. He was a Hillelite Pharisee. Like that's what he saw. It's from his perspective. Very, very good book. Not very long either. Really, really heavily sourced, very scholastic. Highly recommend that. And so that actually is a weird, I know I just brought up a book, but that's going to bring me into our next common objection. And so that would be, he rejected their traditions / rules. We get this one a lot, actually. Even from our own camp, actually, from Torah observant Christians on the same side as us, we get this a lot, actually.
Well, I would dare say more so, right? I think that the Torah observant movement has more vitriol against the Pharisees than your general Christian who is not Torah observant. And that's because there's a vested interest in it, right? So the Torah observant movement thinks that they have rediscovered the Torah. And so the question of what Jesus was preaching against, right? Because when you grow up learning that Jesus was preaching against the Torah because he was ushering in something new, when you find out that that's not true, now you have to answer, well, what was he preaching against if it wasn't the Torah? And the victim of this line of if-then questioning tends to be the Pharisees and their traditions.
Which, you know, fair play. On a surface level reading, you're going to get, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you set aside the commandment of God for the traditions of men. Very, you know, a cut and dry reading like that, you are going to come away with, all right, so their traditions and rules he rejected. And traditions and oral traditions are quintessential Pharisee pillars. What sets the Pharisees apart from basically the rest of Judaism in the first century is the idea that there is an oral tradition, a second co-equal Torah, so to speak. And so every other sect of Judaism either rejected outright or had a completely different version of the secondary Torah than the Pharisees. In fact, basically they all sort of rejected it in some way, shape, or form, except for maybe the Essenes, and they had their very own unique sort of style to in oral tradition. Yeah, and they are an offshoot from Phariseeism anyway, so it makes sense that they would actually carry over a lot of oral tradition into being an Essene. So to this objection, I would actually say that, and this is sort of the perspective, particularly of Rabbi Harvey Falk here, that he really only rejects Beit Shammai. Right, the rulings of Beit Shammai. So we talked about in our previous episode how Beit Shammai is the majority opinion in Jesus' day, all the way up to the Second Temple's destruction in 70 CE. And Shammai maintains that foothold of being in the majority even after his death. His house, you know, continues to rule until the Sanhedrin moves to Yavne after the destruction, and then Hillel, Beis Hillel, becomes the majority. But until then, it's Beit Shammai is the majority. And so when we see him pushing back against these traditions, we actually see that these are very particular and specific examples of Beit Shammai style Phariseeism that he's rejecting, while we also see him at the same time upholding and supporting in a lot of ways Beit Hillel Phariseeism, which is why understanding Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel is incredibly important to understanding this next phase of the episode. Because, you know, some people are familiar, Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, and they get it, but they still think that Yeshua kind of rejects both sides in favor of his very own side. And I would actually argue, and so would the author of this book, that he was a Hillelite. He sided with Hillel on a lot of issues, more often than not.
This actually, generally, it goes back to the ignorance that I was talking about before. When you get into this discussion and you begin to explain and expound on the differences between the sects of Pharisee thought that existed in the time, generally what I end up being met with is attempts to interpret the passages in the New Testament in a way that would force them to be broad and generic over the entire sect of Phariseeism, and trying to discount and discredit the idea that they are directly pointed. And the reason for this is because it's a very easy thing to dispel. Just ask them to point out one single theological doctrinal teaching of Jesus that is not Pharisaic in its nature. They can't answer that question because they don't know what the Pharisees believe. They don't know what their theology was. They haven't read enough to know that. So they have to find some way to derive an argument that is broad sweeping over the whole branch of Phariseeism from the text, because they don't have the answer to the question.
Right. And like Phariseeism, as we covered in a couple of last episodes, most of the core tenets of Phariseeism is what becomes Christianity's core tenets. The belief in the afterlife, resurrection of the dead, end times, a punishment in the afterlife, reward in the afterlife. These are all very Pharisaic.
The golden rule.
Pharisaic doctrines, which again, we see Yeshua, all of his teachings are based off of these things. They're very Pharisaic in nature. But his rejection of their traditions, actually. So I want to give a particular example, actually, from Luke's gospel in chapter 11, verse 37. And I'm going to relate it to something that's actually right out of the Mishnah to show that Yeshua seems to always side with Hillel, and he's constantly fighting against Shemite Pharisees. Every time he's talking to Beit Shammai, it seems. And all the evidence, the cultural, historical evidence seems to point to this. So a Pharisee visits Jesus for a meal, which, by the way, is an indicator that he is a Pharisee. Pharisees only have table fellowship with other Pharisees. They do not eat at the same table as other non-Pharisees. Remember the episode where the Pharisees ask his disciples, why does your master eat with sinners, sit at the same table and eat with sinners? The reason they're asking that question is because if he's a Pharisee, they're like, whoa, Pharisees, we don't do that. Why is your master doing that? Doesn't he know? Like, so the fact that they treat him as an equal, they ask him that question, cues us in to the fact that they treat him as a peer. And so that stands out. That's weird. And that's why they ask. But anyway, so he's eating a meal with a fellow Pharisee, again, because he's a Pharisee. So let's see. The Pharisee, in the gospel, the Pharisee is complaining to Jesus that his disciples do not wash their hands before eating. And the Pharisee in question here is surprised that Jesus didn't wash his hands first before the meal. All right. So Jesus replied, now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup. And this leads into an attack on the Pharisees, similar to Matthew chapter 23. Washing the hands before meals has its source in the 18 edicts, by the way. That's Shabbat 13 Bravo through 15 Alpha in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Talmud Bavli. And would have no relation to Jesus' remark concerning the outside of the cup. Jesus is clearly referring here to the dispute between the two schools over when hand washing should take place. This is in the Mishnah, Berachot 51b. According to the Talmud, meals of the Pharisees would begin with the drinking of the cup of wine, after which they would break bread. Now, Beit Shammai held that you should wash your hands before you fill the cup of wine, whereas Beit Hillel believed that you should wash your hands after you've blessed the wine. So that's the way that a Jewish meal goes. For those of you who don't know, you would say Kiddush over, you say blessing over wine, and then you'd say blessing over bread, and you break bread and pass it, and then begin the meal. So there's a dispute as when you should wash your hands before eating. Hillel was of the opinion that you could wait until after the wine and wash just before bread. The reasoning behind this, the passage in Luke, the Talmud explains that Beit Shammai were concerned that the cup of wine might become ritually unclean from the hands, whereas Beit Hillel held that it is permitted to use a cup which had become unclean from the outside. The passage in Luke, therefore, tells us that Jesus upheld Beit Hillel's ruling concerning the outside of the cup and wished to wash later before the bread. The Talmud further makes clear that Beit Shammai considered those following Beit Hillel's rulings as eating with unclean hands, as the unclean cup would defile the hands, and this explains the accusation against the disciples. So, and that's from the book. This is a very clear cut, like he's actually siding with Hillel, and that's actually something that you really would not know is happening if you read that passage in Luke by itself without any Jewish background. But from a Jewish background, you read that passage and you're like, oh, this makes sense. This is actually straight out of the Mishnah. He seems to be siding with Hillel here. That's very interesting. So, and then of course that makes sense because Yeshua goes on to accuse the Pharisees of caring more about the cleanliness of the outside rather than on the inside, which is directly pulled from the Mishnah Berachot 51b, which is what Shammai is worried about and Hillel was not worried about.
And this is not the first time that Yeshua is found upholding something that Shammai had already previously taught, or that Hillel had already previously taught. Yeah. Pardon me. But so one of my favorite examples, though, is it's kind of between two passages, right? So we've got Mark chapter 12, where the Pharisees come first. Well, to preface, right, the Sadducees ask Yeshua a question about the resurrection. Now, they don't believe in the resurrection, and this is where Yeshua essentially makes that statement that I said earlier: you're too ignorant to realize that you're stupid, right? And he just dismisses them entirely. And so the Pharisees were sitting and watching this conversation, and seeing that he had silenced the Sadducees entirely, one of them came to ask him a question. Now, we're always presented this scenario as though they're trying to trip him up, right? Because the Sadducees had their turn. Now it's the Pharisees' turn to trip him up, right? And it's totally projected into the passage. So somebody asks him, what is the greatest commandment? Now, I chose Mark. This also happens in Matthew, but I chose Mark 12 because Mark 12 is where Yeshua opens with the Shema, right? It says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second is like it, which is love your neighbor as yourself. That, and even paired with the golden rule, which we find in Matthew 7:12, which everybody's familiar with, right? So in all things, do to others what you would have them do to you. Both of these instances together are almost a direct citation of Hillel. What we find in Tractate Shabbat 31a is that there was another incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai and said to Shammai, convert me on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I am standing on one foot. Shammai pushed him away with the builder's cubit in his hand. This was a common measuring stick, and Shammai was a builder by trade. The same Gentile came before Hillel. He converted him and said to him, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. This is the entire Torah. The rest is its interpretation. Go and study. Right? What does Yeshua say in Mark and Matthew after listing those two commandments? He says that on these two,
hang the
entire Torah.
Yep. So now I've heard it brought up. Well, Hillel said it differently. Hillel said the negative of the same verse because he was talking to a Gentile and not a fellow Jew, and that's really what it comes down to.
That's easy, right? Hillel is talking to a Gentile. Gentiles don't know not to do bad, right? at this point,
in this day and age, yes,
right. At this point in time, right? He's speaking to somebody who's formerly pagan, right? This person has not already learned not to do bad. So that's the first thing you have to teach them, right? Because even as the Proverbs and Psalms say, right? Flee from evil and seek good. But seeking good comes after fleeing from evil, right? Yeshua is speaking to Jews who have already grown up learning Torah. They already know what not to do, but in certain instances, there's no direct command to proactively seek to do that which is good to others. And so this is what he's emphasizing.
And this very question is actually, again, another indicator. This is the question that you would ask to find out what house a particular student is coming from and whether or not you wanted to study under this particular rabbi. It would depend on how he would answer this question. Because for Shammai, the answer to this question, what's the most important commandment? The answer to this question was love God and keep the Sabbath. And for Hillel, it was love God, love people. And so it's...
An example that I came up with recently to illustrate how this question hits the ear of the crowd and how the answer hit the ear of the crowd, right, is essentially the question was asking, whose Torah philosophy do you uphold, right? That's what it's asking, because there were 7 different answers to this question that everybody already knew that there were 7 different answers to this question so far. So if Yeshua were really trying to distinguish himself from the Pharisees, this would have been the most important place that he could have done it. This would have been the single most important place that he could have distinguished himself from Hillel and all of the other Pharisees. But he didn't, and he didn't even attempt to. He straight up just gave Hillel's answer to the question. So this question is the equivalent of today if somebody were to ask you, who is your favorite president? But they specifically say, tell me who your favorite president is, by citing their slogan.
Yeah,
right?
Something like that.
And if you were to respond with "Make America Great Again," we all know who that is. You didn't make it up.
Yeah. That's kind of what it sounds like. And again, the geopolitical contexts of this whole thing, Phariseeism is also doubles as a as a political group. So these philosophies and slogans are very common. And of course, every Jew knows, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. That's sort of the first and foremost, and many that's a very, very clear Jewish statement of faith. So,
yep,
there's a lot there. But when it comes to rejecting his traditions, I've got a dedicated episode planned where I go through Tractate Nedarim, page 64, talking about the oaths. I think I've brought it up on an episode like this beforehand, at least in the past, one other time maybe, that the exact conversation that Yeshua has with the Pharisees concerning where he says, why do you also transgress the commandment of God? For you say to a person, you allow for sons and to make an oath. What you would have gained from me is korban. It's given to the temple. So this oath thing straight out of Tractate Nedarim. This is actually a conversation between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Now it doesn't say that. It actually mentions two of their top students. It's Akiva and Eliezer. Talking, which they're the two top students for Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, respectively. And this conversation that he has with the Pharisees is almost word for word right out of Tractate Nedarim for this specific thing. And in this case, Yeshua sides with Hillel, again, quoting nearly word for word. Now, Rabbi Akiva lives after Yeshua, so you could argue that Akiva is sort of quoting Yeshua in this instance. But they were both raised Beit Hillel, and so they're really just quoting the same philosophy that they were raised in. And so we see plenty of instances where Yeshua is directly leaning on the traditions as being authoritative, which again, Matthew 23 verses 1-3, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. Therefore, whatever they tell you to do, make sure you do it. Just don't do what they do, tying up heavy burdens on people and not lifting a finger to help. That's Hillel Phariseeism, actually. Hillel said those exact things. He would always say, I disagree with Shammai, but he made a ruling, and so I will follow that ruling. And so Hillel was very humble in that way. And so he actually directed his school to follow the rulings of Shammai because they were more stringent, even though his rulings were much more lenient and easier. But to meet them at that level of righteousness, and very humble. And so Yeshua is saying the same thing. He's telling his disciples, hey, I know we disagree with them, but they're in control. They have the power. That's the way Judaism works here. It's a majority rule, unfortunately, like it or not. So whatever they tell you to do, do it. Just whenever you find yourself sitting in their seat, don't do the things that they're doing, which was very, very Hillelite of him. So, actually, that brought me to another point, and it just escaped.
When it comes to rejecting the traditions, right? Even let's return to Matthew 23 real quick, because this is an incredible example where specifically in verse 23, Yeshua mentions a specific tradition, right? That these Pharisees that he's addressing go so far as to tithe the mint, dill, and cumin, right? They would tithe on their spices.
Yep.
That's not commanded by the written Torah. This is something that was a tradition that these Pharisees were following. Yeshua doesn't rebuke them for doing it. He doesn't say that they shouldn't have been doing it. He simply says that their focus should have been more emphasized on much weightier things. But what does he follow that with? He says, you should have been doing these weightier things and still been doing the other. You're right. So you should have been focusing on these more important things, but you still should have been tithing your spices. So he actually shows an inherent support for these traditions.
Yeah, his problem is the priorities are wrong. So that essentially what they're doing is they're focusing so much on the mint and the dill and the cumin that they've forgotten the weightier things. And he's like, don't leave the other undone while also doing these things. And so he's like, still do these things, but remember what comes first, right? You flipped it up on his head. That was his main complaint when it came to Shemite Pharisees.
And his opening statement, even, right? Because when you go through the rebukes, right, the 7 woes, not a single one of them is doctrinal.
Yeah.
None of them are doctrinal.
It's all about
never
hypocrisy.
once does he say woe to a Pharisaic doctrine, which this is a current challenge that I have going that has yet to be met. Is that I challenge people, if you can find one singular teaching from Yeshua that is not Pharisaic, right, or consistent with Pharisee philosophy, like just one. But be that as it may, his opening statement is that the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So whatever they tell you, right, whatever they teach you, whatever their doctrines are, observe those, right? But don't do what they're doing because they're either not focusing with enough emphasis on the weightier things, or they simply have a lack of follow through, right? They're not even doing what they're teaching, which means that Yeshua supported their teachings and their traditions and their doctrines so much that he even thought they should be doing them.
That's really funny, actually. So now let's get into, I guess, another clue then. So we've sort of already talked about this, his commonality with Beit Hillel. So I'm going to skip that one because that's what we've sort of been focusing on already. So his primary method of teaching is actually a massive clue here. This is it's exclusively unique to Pharisaic Judaism at the time, is to teach in the method of parables and to teach using Agadic, Midrashic style, the Pardes, the Pshat, Remez, Deresh, and Sod method of teaching. The parable is this is as Pharisee as it can get, really. This was the easiest way for Pharisees to convey complex teachings to the common people. Because remember, Pharisees get along the best with common people. More than any other sect of Judaism at the time, they really reach out and really relate to and actually, get along with very well the common everyday man, which is why they got so popular. They were very, very well respected. They were well loved. The Pharisees were loved, by the way, in first century Judaism. Josephus tells us this, that they were very, very highly revered. They were considered incredibly pious. And so this is how they got popular, was by this parable teaching method. So the fact that we see Yeshua teaching and almost exclusively in parables to the common person is a massive indicator that he is a Pharisee, actually.
Right.
Yeah,
I've got nothing to add to that. That was said perfectly.
I mean, sometimes, I got a question here. We'll pull it up. So are you saying that Hillel, that was a Hillel student that he was a Hillel student with apocalyptic tendencies? Yeah. In fact, many scholars have said in the past that he, or even in modern day, that he is very apocalyptic in his teaching, in his preaching style, because he focuses on the coming kingdom, which is apocalyptic style. And many of the Pharisees and Essenes, for that matter, were this way. This is one of the reasons why initially people thought that Jesus was an Essene, but that has since been backed away. Now it's starting to lean more towards he was a Pharisee, because the differences that Yeshua has with the Essenes are very weighty, versus the similarities with Phariseeism is incredibly weighty versus his not so similarities with Essenes. But yeah, he was very apocalyptic. That was common. That's not unheard of for his day.
Yep, I gotta say, by the way, buenos noches, Aruz, my friend. This is investigating the Bible. Definitely go follow that channel, because he's just started it, and he's got a couple of videos up now. There's definitely going to be some great information coming from that channel. This is one of the Orthodox Jewish friends that I have made in this journey, who has we've had several conversations between he and I, and wonderful individual, very knowledgeable. It's been a blessing being able to speak to him. So thank you for the question, my friend.
So now moving on to another common objection, I guess, because that primary teaching method is, I guess we hit that one pretty well. We're running short on time. So this is one of my favorite objections. And reasons being, and buenas noches, we love you too. You left a comment. Reason being is he's actually not expressly accused of being uneducated. He's actually accused of not being known. We have a lot of evidence that he was educated. His presence in the temple at a very young age, where he's having discourse, not really even discourse, he's having a conversation with Pharisees. Now he's 12 years old. Now, if we go with the timeline that's more or less accepted, he was born in and around at about 4 BCE, which puts him at the age of 12 while Hillel is still alive. Hillel dies in 10 CE. So this is about, 6 to 8, depending on the timeline, 6 to 8 CE. So Hillel is still very much alive. So he's very likely talking with Hillelite Pharisees at this young age, and they're just amazed by how much he understands, which makes him a prime candidate to be a Pharisee. Phariseeism, you would be chosen, you would be picked as the cream of the crop to become a Pharisee. It was a very selective process. That's why it was something to be proud of too. And Paul very much is proud of his accomplishments, because to become one, you got to be hand selected essentially. So that's a key indicator. But the objection really is he shows up and the Sanhedrin doesn't recognize him. That doesn't mean he's not educated. That just means that the members of the Sanhedrin, who are a majority Shemite Pharisees anyway, don't know who he is. It's because he's not a fellow sitting member of the Sanhedrin. But big deal. He comes from the Galilee, which the Galilee is a stronghold for Phariseeism. Phariseeism was its strongest in the Galilee region. And so him being from there means that there's a plethora of teachers to take him. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the Galilee is known in particular for producing great exorcists and healers.
Yeah, actually. and Pharisees. And so it's sort of like we have ample opportunity. We have an example of him having a level of understanding that would make him perfectly qualified to be sitting in a Beit Midrash, to become a Pharisee. And then we see that all of his teachings, the way that he goes about in his ministry is very reminiscent of a Pharisee, of a sitting Pharisee. He's treated by his fellow peers as a fellow Pharisee. And, that's another thing. The minimum age to become a Pharisee in this day is 30.
How about it?
Huh. Well, what age was he when he started his ministry?
On the subject of not being known, right? Because this is something that is mentioned even in John 1, which is one of the most blatant examples, because this is where John the Baptist himself blatantly says that Yeshua is a Pharisee, right? So John 1, you can even start a little farther up, right? You can even start in verse 19 if you want to. Where it says that the Jews from Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who you are. So we already know who was sent. However, the author of John seems to feel the need to specify that these priests and Levites at this point were sent from the Pharisees, which already gives us an indication on who and what they were about, because generally the priests and Levites were what? Sadducees at this point.
Yeah.
Right. So the fact that they had been sent from the Pharisees tells us two things. It tells us, one, that they themselves had Pharisaic leanings, and that, number two, agency is in play here. So John is not addressing the messengers. He is addressing the Pharisees who sent these messengers. And what does he say? He says, one stands among you who you do not know, whose sandal I am not fit to untie. So the idea of not being known at this point, that's kind of neither here nor there, because if we put it in terms of the modern age, how many congressmen are you all actually aware of? Right? Can you name all of the congressmen, or can you just name a few of the big famous names because they're the ones who are most popularized in the media? Right? That there are tons of congressmen that none of us know. It's the fact that the Pharisees don't know him doesn't mean that he's not one of them. At the very best, it means that he's a rather new Pharisee, having just turned 30 himself at this point and began his ministry. But John uses self-exclusionary language here. right? He doesn't say one among us, right? I've heard people say, well, maybe he was just talking about the Jews in general. Well, John himself was a Jew, so he wouldn't say one among you. He would say one among us. I've heard people say, well, maybe he's talking about the priests and Levites. Well, Yeshua was not a priest or a Levite, so he can't say one among you, right? That doesn't work. Who then could he be talking about, and why did the author of John feel the need to specify that these were Pharisees that he was speaking to? And John says, one among you, points the finger at these Pharisees. One among you that you don't know yet is coming after me. He's clearly calling Yeshua a Pharisee.
I think that this also harkens back to, because the gospel writers are, at the very least, what we can tell, really familiar with Jewish tradition. And we know that the idea that he will be a leper in the house of study is another key indicator that he seems to be a fellow Pharisee who would eventually be rejected by his own people, like a leper in the house of study, so to speak. And so there's a lot here that we can see from the historicity of the Gospels, that there's actually every indication to really believe that Yeshua is in fact a Pharisee, even if he's like not an officially ordained Pharisee, which is not really a thing. You would have smicha for being a sitting member of the Sanhedrin, but to be a Pharisee, you didn't necessarily need ordination or smicha like you do today. That's more of a late rabbinic adaptation after the fall of Yavna and everything, fall of Jerusalem into Yavna. But yeah, we at least can tell that the Pharisees seem to treat him like a fellow peer, and they had a name for this, because again, table fellowship was exclusive to each other, and so they called each other by the name, or by the word chevarim, which is essentially friends in Hebrew, and so it was a pretty exclusive club to an extent. It was not like the Essenes, where the Essenes are incredibly exclusive, where you can't even touch a stranger who's not really an Essene. But it's exclusive enough that table fellowship with somebody other than a Pharisee or higher is sort of unheard of. And again, that leads us into the whole. Oh, and the reason we're focusing on table fellowship is actually 60% of all of the rulings that are attributed to Pharisees in the Talmud are about table fellowship. So table fellowship is actually incredibly important to Pharisees of this day. And we see this again in Paul, where Paul is very heavily focused on table fellowship with non-Jews and emphasis on trying to treat them as equals, rather than, this idea of exclusivity that the Pharisees have. He seems to be sort of fighting the idea that Gentiles need to be treated like others, which, again, that's very reminiscent of Hillel. Hillel was very inclusive to non-Jews. He was very friendly, and we go over this in our previous episode in part 4. But Shammai was not. And Shammai, again, in Paul's day, is actually the majority view. It's the dominating view, the 18 edicts. And so eating with a non-Jew is taboo, and you don't do it. And that's what Paul is fighting against, and others, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Rabbi Harvey Falk, other rabbis have made the case that it seems to be that what Yeshua is trying to do is reinstate Hillelite Judaism in his day, while also remaining obedient to whatever form of Judaism happens to be sitting on the seat of Moses, so to speak. He's not looking to throw up a revolution. He's looking to make a sort of what is it? A Reformation-ish, but not the same thing. Not a revolution.
Right. Right. I think that's actually the position of Rabbi Eliyahu Tzvi Soloveitchik also. He would be another rabbi who would tend to make the same case.
So, and there's actually in the opening of this book too, which is great. He translates a letter from Rabbi Yaakov and Emden, and you can read the whole letter for yourself. It's basically Rabbi Yaakov Emden's thoughts on the person of Jesus as a Pharisee, more or less. It's very good. Okay, so I don't want to spend a lot of time investigating the Bible. that this is not Pharisaic Judaism, the idea of a dying Messiah. We do have a dedicated episode to this concept of the two different Messiahs, of the suffering servant and the conquering king, and how this concept within first century Judaism at the time, I understand that this is not modern Judaism, but first century Pharisaic Judaism was still very fluid. And at the time, this was not unheard of. It was fairly normal. And we have Talmudic tractates pages to back this up. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I know that is a legitimate question. So I did want to at least say something before moving on to our final point. So we're a minute over time, so we'll just wrap this up. There's so much more we could still go over, but hopefully this is a great starting point for a lot of people. But this is our final point. Why is this important? In fact, give me your opinion. Why do you think this is important?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to restore, maybe not necessarily restore the relationship, but to restore the image of Judaism and God's people for Christianity. Because in as much as many churches support Israel, they're very pro-Israel. Politically speaking, that can be said to be true. But it only takes a short stream of questioning, right? It's a very small chain of questions to ask most of these people before they find themselves thinking anti-Semitic thoughts in an endeavor to answer these questions. And this is because of an image that has been cultivated in Christianity of the Pharisees in the New Testament that is now projected on the rest of Judaism at large. And it's not correct. It's not respectful. It's not honoring. And it's not right. So I think this is important, first, to humble Christianity. And that ultimately, humbling Christianity, is going to be the first steps towards rebuilding a legitimate relationship between Christianity and Judaism.
Yeah. And then, of course, we may have to do an episode 2 where we go over some more of this. So if you want another episode, leave a comment, leave a like. If this video gets enough views and likes, then we'll definitely do an episode 2. Why I think it's important. We all say that we want to, at some point, every Christian in their life makes the same prayer. Make me in the image of your son, right? Whether you're a Christian, Episcopalian, Catholic, doesn't matter. That's usually a prayer that's said at some point. And Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, imitate me as I imitate the Messiah. Okay. So unfortunately, because of the parting of ways after the Second Jewish Revolt, the traditions that would have been the sect of essentially the Nazarenes, the early Jewish Christians, and the kind of minhag, the traditions that they would have passed down and held, ceases to exist because of the partings of ways. The church tradition does not maintain these traditions. They make no attempt at trying to maintain early, the first, like the Church of Acts traditions. And they go about and they completely revise Christianity in its entirety for the next 300 years. So why is it important? Imitation. We want to be walking in the same image as the Messiah, as who we believe is the Messiah. Paul said to do the same. And now Paul was a Hillelite Pharisee trained at the feet of Gamliel, who was Hillel's grandson. So we know that Paul was a Hillelite Pharisee. So Paul's actions would very much reflect Hillelite Phariseeism and the tradition of his day. It's very fitting that Yeshua chooses Paul, in fact, because Paul, having never met Yeshua, it wouldn't matter if they're raised in the same school of thought. Whether he met Yeshua or not doesn't matter at all if they're trained in the same school of thought, which seems to be the case again. And so the best way that we can understand how we should walk our lives today is to understand what Hillelite Phariseeism looked like, so that we can understand what Paul's life looked like, what Yeshua's life looked like, and what true Christian tradition should look like today. We should always be constantly looking back and trying to make improvements on the future with what we now know. And this is the first step, is really just admitting that Yeah. Okay. He's a Pharisee of the Hillelite tradition. Hillel Phariseeism is probably as close as we're going to get that we can know. And so it's something that we should be open to. And that's why I think it's important. I think we should be open to it and adopting those practices to keep the tradition of what Yeshua was living and what Paul was living alive as much as possible, which is actually fairly Judaism today is Hillelite Judaism by and large. And we went over that in last week's episode, how Judaism today is essentially Hillelite Judaism, not Shemite Judaism, which Paul was fighting against and Yeshua was also fighting against. Yeshua and Paul happen to live in a very unique part of Jewish history. And so it's very important to understand that. So I have one more point. I think we can go another 5 minutes. But did we want to talk about the slaughter of the prophets?
Ooh, you know what? Yes, go there. Go there. It's important.
Okay. I know you love this, so I'm going to let you take the wheel on that one.
Oh, no. I didn't prepare notes like you did on that, but I love the argument.
Oh, okay. So at some point, Yeshua accuses the Pharisees he's talking to as being sons of the people who killed the prophets. We go over this in last week's episode. So if you want more information on this particular episode of what's happening here, I highly recommend watching last week's Hillel versus Shammai. But at some point before the 18 edicts are enacted, which is primarily against Gentiles, the Jerusalem Talmud records that the disciples of Shammai were slaughtering disciples of Hillel in order to prevent them from voting against the 18 edicts outside of they were holding this vote in. When Yeshua makes this claim, he tells them in the Gospels, he calls them sons of people who killed the prophets. It's important to note that the disciples of Hillel are called in the Talmud as being prophets. And I'm looking for the exact citation now, where you can find that in the Talmud. But
it's an important thing. I'll explain real quick while you're looking why it's important to point out, right? Because he can't be talking about the prophets of the Tanakh, right? Because no Pharisee there is responsible, nor are their predecessors responsible for the slaughtering of the prophets in the Tanakh, right? And that's for those who were even slaughtered. Some of them weren't. Most of them weren't actually. There's only a few who were actually put to death at any point. So we're not talking about those, and that was idolaters and idolatrous kings that would have done that at this point, not religious leaders of any Pharisaic movement. So Yeshua can't be talking about them. So what prophets is he talking about? What prophets were killed, and why are these Pharisees that he's addressing responsible for it? Or why are their fathers responsible for it?
Yeah. And so I found the reference. It's from Sukkah 28a and Bava Batra 134a. And it's many of Hillel's disciples, some of who were killed that day, are referred to in the Talmud as prophets. That's page 123 in the book, if you're wondering what the reference is. I'm telling you, it's a good book. It's a great starting place. It's not a great finishing area. I would recommend more books after this, but it's a good starting place. But that's another, like, this little clue here. Now, he's not claiming to be a Hillelite disciple by making this accusation, but that cues us into who he's talking to. That tells us that he's specifically addressing the students of Beit Shammai, that he's not talking to students of Beit Hillel. He's not accusing them, and he's not calling them hypocrites and morons or whatever. He never uses that word, but he's not addressing them with this style of vitriol. He's specifically addressing Beit Shammai with this style of vitriol, and that passage is our clue to that all of his complaints are specifically geared towards Beit Shammai and not Beit Hillel, on top of everything we talked about today. So yes, I will bless those who bless the like button. Anyway, did we have a meme of the week?
I texted you a few options.
Oh, I didn't pick one out.
So
Did you
I
text them
gave
to me
you,
just now?
yeah.
Oh, you did. You did. Let me see. Oh, I seen a couple of
There were a few that were gold, and I was like, all right, well, I'll select the pool that Seamus selects from.
let's see. Come on, zoom in. I can't. All right, I got it. Let me pull it up. Talk to the crowd while I do this.
Oh, let's see.
Wow, that was it, huh? All right.
Well, no, I'm reading through. I'm reading through because Cassius Clay just posted a few things in the chat. Let's see. Appreciate you guys for doing so. So I actually have been thinking about starting, and the chat can let me know what they think about this. I've been thinking about starting an apologetics course, actually, to kind of teach my mode of thought when in debate, right? To kind of teach how to build the arguments that I build, because not to be conceited, but I feel like I'm pretty good at making arguments. There we go.
That's the one. And that is the meme of Chloe Aviva. Congratulations, you are a Balame meme.
Yeah. That one, I lost it when I read that this week. It was, and I was having a bad day too. So like, it was doubly good.
That one is particularly really well done. I like that.
For those who don't get it, right, you can't read Hebrew. This is a particular scene from an old movie from like the 90s, where these two gentlemen have seen something that is somewhat stunning or shocking to them, and so they both scream out an expletive, or I don't know. It's not
usually
really
spelled DAMN, but the way you would say that in Hebrew is as close as you're going to get to DAMN.
Right. Yeah. And that is the word for blood.
Yeah. Which it's so well done, is it? So for blood, it's dam, but dam. It's so good. It's really well done. So congratulations, Chloe. You're the winner of the Balami meme. You're our meme lord of the week. Another thing, quick shout out to our Patreon supporters, you fellow heretics. You guys are what makes the dream work. So here's your shout out. Thank you very much for your generous contributions. May Hashem bless you abundantly for your donations. We really appreciate all you do. And this episode is brought to you by these lovely supporters. They've been asking for these episodes for what feels like months now.
Yep.
And we finally were able to pull all of the sources together to get it done for you guys in the series. And then, of course, the book giveaway will be announced, I believe, next week. Yes. And so if you want to enter into the book giveaway, you'll automatically be entered if you become a supporter at any level. Level starts at $1. You can support us on either alternatemedia.com or the Patreon, alternate media, Patreon.com/alternate media. Altar is spelled ALTAR, altar, yep. Alternate media.
And for tonight's episode, this is what we believe is a very, very important topic, and we definitely appreciate the donations and the time and the encouragement that you all give us, because on this topic, we are in the process of writing a book that's much more exhaustive and goes into much more detail specifically about this topic. Mm-hmm. So it's actually in our preparation for tonight, we realized that there is so much that we have to add to what we already have written collectively between us on the subject. So yeah, it's a slow moving process, but eventually Alternate Media will have their first published book, and it will be on this topic.
Yep. Hopefully, God willing. So if you are a supporter at any level, join the Discord anyway. The Discord is lit, all right? And you don't have to be a supporter. Anyone can enter to be the Balhami meme, to be the meme lord. But if you are a supporter, we do an after show called the After Pardes. Pardes coming from the Peshat, Remez, Deresh, and Sod. It's the acronym for the Jewish hermeneutic method of study. Peshat, plain meaning. Remez, hinted at. Deresh is sort of the pulled out meaning. It's like to puzzle together. It's like midrash, and Sod is mystical. And so Pardes, it sounds like parties. So that's what we're doing. So we call it an after Pardes. And all the supporters at any level, you can hang out with us one-on-one. You can ask us questions. You can sit with us in total and complete awkward silence if you want to. It's whatever you guys want to do. We can talk about nothing. We can talk about anything. We can talk about tonight's show. But you get us. It's at least an hour. And we'll chill out with you in the Discord, in the After Pardes. It's exclusive to our supporting members at any level. Once again, thank you for all of your support, everybody. And so, all those who are supporting, we will see you in the After Pardes immediately following the show.
Absolutely. And, as always, we certainly hope that tonight has enriched you in some way, be it your knowledge of history or your relationship with Hashem in general. Whatever it is, we hope that tonight's episode has blessed you, and we certainly hope to see you again next week for what we'll be talking about then. With that said, let's go over to the After Pardes. Everyone else, L'chaim.
L'chaim.